I don't think the reason that first-time buyers are missing out on buying homes in new developments is because of external investors or UK-based investors.
Who would ever do a no-fault eviction as a landlord?
The planning process is severely broken. It's never been harder to make money in this industry. There's 1.3 million people on the waiting list for a council house. A landlord doesn't want a void. They don't want to kick people out. If they kick people out of their homes, it's generally because there's a reason for it. Jack, what are your thoughts on the reforming the planning system? Election results. This is the outcome, landslide victory from Labour. I think most people did expect that realistically. Conservative loss is the biggest loss in a long time for them. And a few other people popping up. Nigel Farage has won his seat. They've got 4 or 5 other seats for the Reform Party. Crushing victory for Keir Starmer. And we'd like to just talk about some of those top priorities that they're trying to come in and influence, and then mainly focusing on the housing sector and all of the policies that they're trying to bring in. So I realise I've been speaking for 3 minutes. Hello, Jack.
Hello, everyone.
Cool. So some of the top priorities that Labour are trying to bring in, let's start more broadly. So they want to provide economic stability with clear rules on tax and spending, including no increases to existing income tax rates, national insurance or VAT, which welcome change as far as I'm concerned. I mean, how they're going to implement that. And I think with all of these policies, it's about the detail. They can claim everything that they want, but how are they actually going to facilitate that and actually drive those changes forward? You know, fundamentally, it's going to be more taxes somewhere, and those taxes may well fall on business owners.
Yeah, probably on the other area of the market, the minority. And it definitely seems, we've been talking about what they're planning on bringing in, and discussions on rent caps specifically to dial down into housing will be where the tax is then taken from one part and relieved in another. We just have to see the detail on that. I mean, they're known to be a more taxing government than the Conservatives.
Yeah, and when you look down their list, so just very quickly, kind of cutting NHS waiting times with 40,000 more appointments a week by paying staff more to work weekends and evenings. Good idea. Again, detail, creating a border security command, setting up a great British energy and publicly owned clean energy firm to create jobs, cut bills and invest in clean energy. Again, it sounds very aspirational. Tackle antisocial behaviour with 13,000 more police, recruit 6,500 more teachers. So we're talking about 40,000 more appointments from the NHS, 13,000 more police and community support officers, 6,500 more I mean, where are these people coming from? If they wanted to be in those sectors, there probably would already be. It's going to be, I guess, more financial incentives for people to join those sectors. I wouldn't want to be a teacher. I think the pay is terrible for the amount of effort that's put in. But let's take a look specifically at the housing. So reform the planning system and reinstate local targets to help build 1.5 million new homes over 5 years. Again, very aspirational. I think we did a piece a couple of weeks ago about the number of actual planning applications or homes that are approved at planning. And historically, I think over the last couple of years, we've averaged about 240,000 new homes being approved. So if we're not actually getting them through the planning process and getting new homes approved, how do we even stand the chance of hitting those 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years? Everyone knows, and we keep banging on about it, the planning process is severely broken. They need more boots on the ground. They need more resource. They need more efficiency, whether that comes through financial means somewhere. We thought that the increase in planning application fees would have gone a long way to help that. It was increased last year, and they almost doubled the fees for planning applications. I actually don't think that was enough. The biggest insult is really that fees associated with the planning applications are not actually ring fenced at all to the planning department. So yeah, I'd want to see if they do increase application fees or do something. Money needs to be directed to the actual planning departments to bolster their resources and manpower to actually cope with the level of planning applications. I'd love to see a little bit more reduction into the amount of planning application assessments and reports that need to go along with the planning applications nowadays. I think that's a massive hold up and a massive cost to us as a developer. And the amount of reports that some councils need where they don't really have specialisms in-house to actually understand what those reports are saying or what they're about. The biodiversity net gain issue, I think, isn't an issue, and I'm not really sure why it's been instigated, but it's costing us developers a huge amount of money. I don't know if that's going to be relooked at. Jack, what are your thoughts on the reforming the planning system?
The devil's going to be in the detail, isn't it? I think that the planning system really could do with like a short-term and a long-term plan. A short-term plan is how do we make our existing system better and more efficient, because it's literally like throwing spaghetti at a wall. whereas the long-term plan is, I think it needs completely changing. It's clearly not working. The councils are under-resourced, they're underpaid. It's almost like everyone in the council is working against private market, and the natural result is we're not producing enough homes. If the planning process was quicker, the cycles of projects would be quicker, which means the banks lending money in and out get their result quicker, which means that the developers get their equity in and out quicker, which means the market moves along a lot quicker. That economic change would be so, like refreshing to be able to like mobilize a lot sooner, because we'd probably spend equal amount of time in planning as we do in any other capacity of our projects. So in the delivery and sales, we've been in planning already for probably a year. And if that was all of a sudden back to how it used to be, where it was 2 or 3 months, think about how the trajectory of where the economic growth of the UK is going, private businesses, housing, hitting our housing targets. So I actually think it needs completely rechanging. Devil is going to be in the detail about how they plan on doing that. I personally think the only way that you can really do that quickly is make sure that if it's a big development, it goes private. So when you go down the route of agreeing an affordable contribution, it then goes to a third-party private consultant, who's normally a planning consultancy firm. They draw up a report on how the affordable contribution sits within your development. We'll have to see, because a lot of people in the market that believe Labour are only out there to support affordable housing. So it'll be interesting to see how it's visioned from a market-wide perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how they act on the whole market.
Yeah, so let's touch on that one. So prioritising the building of social rented homes and give first-time buyers the chance to buy homes in new developments before investors. I don't think the reason that first-time buyers are missing out on buying homes in new developments is because of external investors or UK-based investors. Yes, there are investors buying homes on new developments, but there's still many developments sitting waiting for somebody to buy. First-time buyers have the opportunity to buy in those developments just as much as the investors do. It's how do they buy when they need to have such a big deposit nowadays? They can't save that deposit because of escalating costs elsewhere. The interest payments are through the roof at the moment. There's no incentive. Help to Buy was removed last year, so it's even more difficult for these people to get on the housing ladder. I don't think the issue is that investors are buying homes before first-time buyers. First-time buyers just can't get the deposit.
I think it's more the issue that house prices are way out of kilter against income. The difference between income and house pricing is one of the worst that it's ever been. First-time buyers can't get in the market and actually perform, which is why for the last 7 years, I think Bank of Mum and Dad have been the third largest lender in the UK. There's not many supporting schemes. We've touched on Help to Buy. I believe there'll probably be some form of Help to Buy coming back into the market, which is great for developers. I don't necessarily think it's amazing for the actual end owner. But the fundamental issue for first-time buyers is their income levels versus inflation and property value are so separate and far apart that they need support to get into the position to be able to buy a house.
Yeah, is that not the same for investors in terms of the yield return? A lot of investors are moving out of the market because certainly the Conservative government have brought in the Section 24 tax on landlords. A lot of private landlords that are accidental landlords, they bought their first property, they moved somewhere else, their circumstances changes, they've kept their original property and they're renting it out. Those people are moving out of the market because with all the regulation, it's far more rigid than it used to be a private landlord with 1 or 2 properties. So a lot of those investors are actually moving away from the housing sector.
I think the stats actually on that, it's something like in 2023, 200,000 individual landlord-owned properties came back into the market. Their target is obviously 1.5 million homes over 5 years. So let's call that 300,000. We've already rescinded 200,000 homes back into the market from private landlords into free market, whether that be first-time buyers, middle-time buyers, or other investors for a limited company structure.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how if you go back to kind of previous Labour governments where they've built huge amounts of sort of council housing, and that's great, and that supports what I heard at the RICS event this week is that there's 1.3 million people on the waiting list for a council house, supported living, social rented home, which is massive. We do need to do something about that. Even at the moment, most developments will have above 10 units anyway. Most councils do have a stipulation that it's somewhere between 35 and 50% of all properties do have to have social housing, whether that's like an on-site provision, which they would prefer, or contribution elsewhere. I'll be interested to see how new Labour governments shake that up, or what they want to do to push that even further. Land values are still sky high, construction costs are huge, and what's really being squeezed is the margin of people like us in terms of developers. It's never been harder to make money in this industry. A lot of the people that we speak to are young, and they have parents and uncles and aunties who have been property investors and developers for the last 40 years, and they'll say the same thing. They don't know how they make money anymore. It's harder than it has ever been to be a property developer in this country. So talking about the next point, introducing a permanent mortgage guarantee scheme for first time buyers. Again, it's so difficult to kind of assume where this is going and what the detail is behind this. I don't even know what that would look like, or is that something completely different? I've no idea.
It might be in the US, you can get a mortgage locked in for like 35 years. So in the US, you can buy a property with a mortgage that's fixed rate for 35 years. The longest term loan you can get in the UK, I think, is 10 years on a personal mortgage. Whereas a lot of other countries like the US, you can actually lock it in for 25 to 35 years on the same rate. And all it does is pass it down the chain. The banks then have to think about locking in their money for that long. It doesn't really make a difference to anyone. It just gives you more reassurance that you know where you stand.
Yeah, that sounds actually really good for a homeowner. My sort of counter argument to that comment is that doesn't create a lot of fluidity in the market. Like at the moment, when you've got 2-year fixes, 5-year fixes, early repayment charges, broker fees, valuations, it reduces that fluidity and sort of transactional cost associated with moving house, refinancing, changing rates, all this sort of stuff. So it's great for, I think, the individual buying that. But I imagine there'll be a bit of opposition from lenders because they're not getting all of those associated fees that come with a transaction stroke refinance. I don't know what the maths actually look like from that front, whether the rates that you get on those longer term mortgages are suitable to kind of sustain the business model from the bank.
I think of late, banks just have like one pot that gets split into arrangement fees and the cost of the debt. They'll probably just transition their arrangement fees back into the pot of cost of capital, and they'll have to like try and balance that.
It'd be good to see the detail on that, introducing a permanent mortgage guarantee scheme for first-time buyers. Build a new generation of new towns, fast-track the approval of brownfield sites, and release some low-quality green belt for housing. I actually think this is a great idea. Places like Milton Keynes have been a great success over the last 50 years whenever it was built. Completely new towns. The one thing that was really key to mention, realistically, the lower-hanging fruit is urban regeneration and existing local transport hubs that have all of that infrastructure there. That is the low-hanging fruit where it's going to be far cheaper to do, but longer term we do need to start sprawling out slightly further, creating these new towns to help those housing numbers. The term grey belt, it's keyed here as low quality green belt for housing. The issue is the misconception of what the green belt is, and people see the green belt as luscious forests and open fields. It's not necessarily that. There are still lots of brownfield sites that have existing buildings, derelict buildings, hard standing, and all that stuff that's previously developed within the green belt already. And these are the areas that they're talking about. We've looked at schemes in the past where I remember one in Surrey had loads of random buildings on site, clearly previously developed and brownfield, but it was in the green belt, and therefore development on it was extremely tough. It ended up not going anywhere at all, and that asset is sitting there with overgrown. It's ripe for development, but it's basically in the green belt, so there's huge amounts of scrutiny on developing on those types of land. And if Labour are looking to bring forward some low quality green belt around existing settlements and areas where there is infrastructure, towns, villages, I actually think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think just to touch on that, it dovetails into planning hugely on like where the planning reform is going. Speaking with a friend of ours who's obviously a big land buyer, player, strategic land, he's always said Greenbelt is nowhere near as bad as area of outstanding natural beauty, and Greenbelt actually has less friction on getting sites through planning. And I think now that's even going to become more and more apparent. So for anyone out there using Searchland, Land Insight, and Nimbus Maps, maybe start reconsidering those sites that might be in Greenbelt areas but have a good argument to push them forward for housing. Now I think would be the time to take more of a position on those sites that you would have thought would have been a 6-10 year play on local housing and have to go into the local plan and bits and bobs like that. You may actually get those through.
The next point is making it easier and cheaper for leaseholders to extend leases and ban new leasehold flats while tackling unregulated ground rent charges.
I actually really like that. I think the whole proviso is there's been quite a lot of people that have bought a property, been super excited, and not understood the reality of a short leasehold. So the proviso is good. How they do that is probably going to have to be share of freehold or some sort of decision-making power. If you think about it, leaseholds only have a certain amount of years, but at some point decides that's how many years it's got. But there's no reason why they couldn't be indefinite.
People don't understand the effort that needs to go into managing 8 flats, for example. My flat in Reading is prime example. As a share of freehold, somebody has to manage that block when maintenance happens or when there's issues or break-ins or going the building's insurance and things like that. Most people don't want to take that responsibility, so someone has to. So there has to be some sort of freeholder management company in place that oversees that. And if every flat is a share of freehold and there's the expectation that each leaseholder within that building contributes to the management of that building, there'll be plenty of people that don't understand what's needed, the stress that comes with it. They don't want that. They just want to own a flat and have done with it. And I think there still has to be some form of management company freeholder that takes responsibility for the maintenance of the communal areas, the fire assessments, the buildings insurance and all that sort of stuff. And it's all well and good kind of banning leasehold flats, but there'll be a lot of people that don't understand the issues surrounding sharing freeholds or the responsibilities of a management company within a block of flats. So again, I guess it's going to come down to the detail. The unregulated ground rent charges, absolutely. A few other big home builders have done with their ground rents on freehold properties where they double every 5 years or 10 years, whatever it was. When you look at that and how it compounds over time, there's clearly a reason why that's already been stamped down on. As far as I'm concerned, that is absolutely the right thing to do. So I'm assuming that that's what they mean by tackling unregulated ground rent charges, already starting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with it is we had an employee that had a similar situation. If you have a flat where the ground rent does increase exponentially, your ground rent then becomes such an eye-watering cost that the value of your flat isn't the same as when you bought it. So, for example, let's say you pay 200 grand for a flat and the ground rent is £400 a year. If that then incrementally goes up, when you come to sell your flat, no one wants to pay £400 a month on top of their mortgage. So it's now worth 100 grand and you're on negative equity and no one wants to buy your flat. So that is the real terms of the result. And it is out there. They're changing it now, but there are flats out there that have already got in contract where the service charge is £400 a month, which is absolutely outrageous. And it's those developers that give all of us a bad name because we just want to develop houses that are affordable and someone can pay the actual ground rent that's reasonable for us to charge back. Whereas in actual reality, people were using it as a subliminal profit-making scheme, which has now really impacted some of the consumers in the market, which is why they're now speaking out about it and saying it needs changing.
Final one on the list: ban so-called no-fault evictions and empower renters to challenge rent rises. This one's a tricky one, as an investor, as a developer. The rents rise because of the market, not necessarily because the owner, the landlord, sort of decides that he wants to screw over a tenant. And I think the so-called no-fault evictions, again, a landlord doesn't want a void. They don't want to kick people out. If they kick people out of their homes, it's generally because there's a reason for it, i.e. rents aren't being paid or the tenants are looking after the property poorly. There was a video on Instagram yesterday from an investor who was walking around a house that had been absolutely trashed by their previous tenant, knocking holes in walls. Most landlords do not want to evict tenants. It's as simple as that. They want continuity of income. They don't want voids because that means loss of rent, loss of profit.
I'm completely against it. I think tenants have enough rights. If you do what you say you're going to do, it's an easy relationship. If this was paying for a product and you all of a sudden thought that you don't have to pay for something, you don't get it. And I think that unfortunately for landlords, they always want a good tenant, keep the property in good order and they pay the rent. If you say to the tenant what is a good landlord, most people's opinion should be they give us the service that we should be needed, they repair what we need to be repaired, not it's free, I can do X, Y and Z and completely take the mick. I don't feel the government should give that opinion type a voice. You have to pay for everything in this world. Aside from social affordable housing, if you can't pay or you're in a difficult position, then you can go to Universal Credit and get your housing paid for. That's a different story. I'm referring to like the middle ground where you can afford to pay, but you're not. I mean, what is a no-fault eviction? Who would ever do a no-fault eviction as a landlord?
Yeah, I don't know if it was Labour government or something. I did read someone that somebody wanted to bring in 3-year tenancies. As a landlord, I mean, that sounds great. Yeah, if we can secure people in there for 3 years, then that's fine. But we also need to have the flexibility if we did want to sell the property, for example, or make changes, or for whatever reason, move back into the house or whatever, to have a bit of flexibility there. And I think imposing a 3-year tenancy on some tenants is actually actually not at all what they want. If some people want more flexibility, they only want it for a year because they've got a year's contract in X, Y, and Z, and obviously don't want to be spending a whole year in an Airbnb. So they need a longer term placement. And this is to a certain degree, I've been reading a lot about gig economy and 0 hour contracts. Like, they're there because there's a demand and there's a need in the market, not because some people don't want to put people on a full contract and give security. People want flexibility. They're only there because that's where the market has pushed it, and the opportunities are there to do it. People are taking that opportunity out of choice because they want the flexibility and freedom to do what they want and work when they want, not because it's being impressed upon them.
Property investors and landlords out there that are listening is probably saying that we would actually always push for longer term of lease or rent or whatever it may be. So, for example, if someone comes into your property on a commercial basis and they go, I'm setting up my new business, I don't know whether I can be here for longer than a year, I just want to see how I get on. I always go, right, let's do a 5-year lease with a break every year so that you end up with the same flexibility from your end, but we end up not having to go through the legal process and the referencing process and pulling the contracts together. From a residential perspective, obviously, it's currently at 2 years. You can only really rent at 2 years. Leases on a rent to rent are longer because we're a company and we can do that. But from a residential perspective, it's capped at 2 years. But if it was at 3 years, for an example, what Ben's saying is if someone wants to actually specifically gauge and say, I only want to stay for a year, you could always go, right, 3-year contract, 1 year breaks for you. So you still have the same flexibility.
Cool. All right. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Obviously, big changes are afoot over the next couple of weeks. Is going to have a massive impact on our businesses and everyone really in the whole country. It's a bit massive change. So let's see what happens.